My name is Tom Stone. I'm a senior research analyst here at I4CP, and I have the pleasure most weeks of co-hosting our Next Practices weekly events. This week, I'm joined once again by Lorrie Lykins, our Vice President of Research and Executive Editor. Good morning, Lorrie.
Morning, Tom. Good to see you.
Good to have you with us. You'll be facilitating the conversation with our very special guest in just a few minutes. But before that, a few other quick reminders and announcements. This is Next Practices Weekly, so you see the upcoming lineup on October 17th, 24th, and 31st. We'll have our own Rob Cross from Babson College. He's now an SVP of Research here at I4CP. We'll have him next week with us, and then we'll have guests from Access Capital and T. Rowe Price in the subsequent weeks to round out the month. We also occasionally do calls at different dates and times that are more geared towards our global colleagues in the EMEA or APAC regions. We don't have these every week, but we do them as frequently as we can. You see coming up on November 20th, we'll have some HR leaders from ADM and Vertex Pharmaceuticals with us on the topic of advancing DE&I in the EMEA region, some different issues and different perspectives in that part of the world. So for those of you that are with global companies and maybe have colleagues in EMEA, Europe and Middle East in particular, if you would like to invite them to that call, let them know that it's happening. We'd love to see them get registered and join us. We also once a year gather for a big conference in March. This year it'll be in early March. This past 2024, it was in late March, but in 2025, it'll be March 3rd through the 6th, once again at the lovely Fairmont Princess Hotel in Scottsdale, Arizona. I believe there's still a discount if you register by mid-November. I think you can save up to $300. I believe it's not on the screen, so don't hold me to that. But I believe if you go to i4cp.com/conference and register by mid-November, you can get that discount. You see here just the first announcement of some of the speakers we have lined up. This is similar to past years where we'll have some folks from academia, from business schools like Peter Capelli that you see there. We'll have HR leaders from Atlassian, ServiceNow, Visa, Microsoft. Lots of great HR leaders from different companies, and many more to be announced in the coming weeks and months. So again, it's a great conference. We don't have an expo. There's no trade show, no vendors hitting you up in the hallways and so on. So we'd encourage you to check that out. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to you, Lorrie, to kick things off with our special guest today.
Great. Thanks, Tom. And before we get rolling, I just want to note Zeta, you've probably already seen Zeta in the chat. Zeta will be following the discussion as well as Tom, but she'll be posting respective links throughout our conversation, and also just try to really focus on the conversation. This is recorded, and you can always come back to our website and review the recording. So try to be in the moment with us, because this is just going to be a really great hour with Dr. Tina Opie. So I am going to get rolling. So those of you who were fortunate enough to be with us at our conference this past March in Scottsdale are already familiar with Dr. Tina Opie. She really lit up the whole room, and I think that we probably could have stayed on stage doing Q&A from the audience for another hour or two at least. So we're just a lot of clamoring to have her back, and we're thrilled that she was able to work us into her super busy schedule. So just a quick introduction. Dr. Tina Opie's PhD. She's an organizational expert and a very highly sought after speaker and author. Her research and insights on DE&I, culture, strategy, leadership, allyship, all the things are just really unmatched, without parallel. And she's aware of many hats, as many of us are, but her hats are really fancy. She's the Chief Vision Officer of Opie Consulting Group. She's the creator of the Shared Sisterhood framework, which is what we're going to talk about today. She's founder of this Shared Sisterhood, co-author of the book Shared Sisterhood, How to Take Collective Action for Racial and Gender Equity at Work, and an associate professor of management at Babson College. And she teaches organizational behavior, teaching organizational behavior courses, and so much more. And my favorite quote about Tina is, when organizations are tired of having their butts kicked by culture, diversity, equity, and inclusion, they call Dr. Tina Opie and have her come speak to them. So welcome, Dr. Tina Opie.
Thank you so much, Lorrie. It's great to be back with you all. And Tom, thank you for that wonderful introduction as well. And Zeta for all the behind the scenes things. You all have a great team.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's get into it. Your
Yeah.
shared sisterhood framework. I know it's been adopted by thousands of change makers, a lot of organizations, and you've presented on this from groups from 50 people to 5,000, and talked about this from the front line to the C-suite. Your message that gender equity cannot happen without racial equity, I think is very powerful. It's also very optimistic, but also perhaps a little anxiety producing for people who really sincerely want to be allies and help advance the work, but they're really unsure of how to go about it. So let's get rolling with the shared sisterhood framework, how it came to be, and its elements of dig, bridge, and collective action.
Thank you so much for that, Lori. So as we discussed before, and I'm sorry if some people are hearing this again, but I think it's important to go to the basics as Lori's questions allude to. About 15 to 20 years ago, I was sort of looking around in society, and I sort of wondered or pondered, if feminism is real, why aren't specifically Black and white women helping each other more? And I asked that question because I had worked as a banker, as a consultant, an entrepreneur, and now a professor. And in each of those contexts, I was puzzled by the division. You know, if you look at who has lunch with whom, if you look at who is sort of advocating for whom, it often seemed to devolve into identity schisms, if I'm honest. And it just didn't make sense to me. And I'm married to a historian, and I started to do some reading on workplace history, which is really interesting if you ever have a chance, just to sort of think about how we came to have the situations that we have now. And one of the things that was really evident was that we don't know each other, we don't trust each other, we're not often exposed to each other. And one of the things that I like to do whenever I do research is I first start with sort of checking myself. So before I go off and say, well, you all need to be doing X, Y, Z, Tina, what can you do? And I realized that in the most successful conversations I've ever had about coming together, changing culture, diversity, equity, and inclusion, those conversations were best able to be held when I had a deep connection with the other person. And I'll use my co-author, Dr. Beth Livingston, as an example. We co-wrote the book Shared Sisterhood. And while I had come up with the idea about 15 or 20 years ago, the white paper that I wrote by myself, it was terrible. Because how are you going to write about connecting with people who are different than you by yourself? I'd like to see anybody try to do that. So I sort of dusted, blew off the white paper and said, Beth, I know we're both interested in racial equity, gender equity, and equity in general. Would you like to join me for this paper? And she said, yes. So we together developed and fleshed out Dig, Bridge, and Collective Action because we wanted to put our imprint on what was a very confusing time. You all, if we go back to 2020 with George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and so many others were murdered, when there was anti-Asian hate, when Asian people, especially elders, were being attacked in New York and California, when there were murders in Atlanta, the Me Too movement, Tarana Burke's work had been gaining traction. There was anti-LGBTQ legislation that was being passed across the country, well, honestly, around the world. And I don't know about you, but I felt depressed. There was a moment where I was depressed, crying. I didn't want to talk to anyone, but that's not my MO. My MO is I'm definitely a fighter. If they say if you fight or flight, I'm more likely to fight, and I don't mean physically, unless it's necessary. Just kidding. But so the way that I fight is verbally, is through my writing, is through the research that I do. And so Beth and I put our heads together because we were sort of, well, what's going to happen? How are we going to get out of this? And we realized, okay, let's look in the mirror. We're educated, we're intelligent, we're in this field. What can we do? So then we went about writing the book. And the first part, as Lori mentioned, is there's Dig, Bridge, and Collective Action, which are the three component parts of Shared Sisterhood. And Shared Sisterhood is really the response that we had, is sort of this very optimistic idea that together we can come together. That's fine, Tom. Together, we can use our trust in each other, our empathy, risk-taking, and vulnerability to forge deeper bonds. And then link arms and collectively dismantle workplace and hopefully societal inequities. I mentioned those 4 components: trust, vulnerability, empathy, and risk-taking, because what Beth and I have found through our research as well as interviews and anecdotes is that those 4 elements, and there may be others, and I welcome you all to brainstorm if you want to, even in the chat, and say there might be other things that you want to consider. But what we found and what we're beginning to empirically test is that these 4 attributes are critical for developing authentic relationships. Shared sisterhood is not about friendship. Okay, and I do want to say that because some people say, Tina, I don't necessarily want to be friends with people at work. Okay, well, cool. I hope you might want to change that. But even if you don't want to be friends, you can engage in shared sisterhood. The difference between shared sisterhood and friendship is that in friendship, you may or may not ever talk about things like power or inequity. You might just come together and talk about, your family or the latest movies or the books or books you've read. With shared sisterhood, you are specifically centering on how your interpersonal relationship, your authentic relationship, can forge deeper connections so that you all together can help to dismantle systemic inequity. Tom, can you go to the next slide for me? Thank you. So as Lorrie mentioned, the first 2 steps of shared sisterhood are dig and bridge. So dig is introspective. As I mentioned, when I started this about 20 years ago, and I was in those different domains of banking, consulting, entrepreneurship, et cetera, I would try to broach conversations with different individuals at work. And these were often white people because honestly, I was typically one of the only Black people or women of color or people of color in all of the institutions where I've worked. So I was typically one of the only or one of the few. And what I found was that when I tried to have conversations with people, and I don't use the term majority or minority, I use the term historically power dominant and historically marginalized. And the reason I do that is because undergirding a lot of the conversations we have about diversity, equity, and inclusion is the issue of power. And I really want to take a moment to discuss that with you all. And I don't know if you all have comments in the chat. Power we define as access to and control over resources. So things like money, time, human resources, technology, history. One of the common examples I use, and I use this example a lot because it keeps coming up, whose history is considered central versus whose history is considered extracurricular, that's determined by power. That is determined by power. And the term historically power dominant, this is a group level construct. And this is, again, critical that we have this conversation. It's a group level construct. So if I were to ask you all to put into the chat, we did this when I came to Scottsdale. We just asked for audience participation. What are the groups that have historically had more access to resources, have historically had more power? And so I'll pause to see if anyone is bold enough to put things into the chat, because that would be helpful. I am, if you cannot tell, an extrovert, so I love to interact with the audience. So virtual can be challenging, but you all can help me out here by putting things. So Christine, thank you. So I see men, white men, yeah. And I would say it's men, but it is more specifically white men, correct? And that's not to put white men on notice. We are just stating facts. We are just stating facts. This is not about dividing and conquering, but they're, heterosexual people, Christian people in the United States. Believe it or not, tall people. I'm 6 feet tall. I've enjoyed the privilege of being tall. Tall people, people with wealth, people with education, people who are, yes, able-bodied people, neurotypical. I'm someone who has ADHD, so I'm neurodivergent. And I can tell you there are definitely privileges associated with people who are neurotypical, even though I think having ADHD is a superpower myself, but that's a whole different conversation. the reason why it is critical to have this conversation. Now, Tanya, I don't know what you were saying yes to about ADHD being a superpower. And so for those on the call, that's an example of what ADHD happens. I will not be able to move on until Tanya tells me what she was saying yes to, because my mind is I'm processing that. So Tanya, do me a favor, please. Help your sister. Yes, perfect. Okay. I can take a deep breath now. I think that it is critical that we be able, yeah, my mother is left-handed. So Jessica, thank you. She's left-handed. And in school, she was punished for writing with her left hand. And if you think about the way that we're taught to write, I remember, I'm revealing my age, but those lined pieces of paper for handwriting, you were told to write from the left to the right. Uh-oh, that's a challenge. You're dragging the ink if you're left-handed. So all of those things, the systems that are built around those individuals from historically power dominant groups, they often don't think about that. But let me ask you if you all can put into the chat, now, what groups have been historically marginalized? Just put into the chat, if you will. So we've just done some historically power dominant groups. And while I'm waiting for you all, so recent immigrants, indigenous people, yes. BIPOC, Black women, yep. People with disabilities, yes. Yes. Non-white people, members of the LGBTQ community, immigrants, people with accents sometimes, depending upon the kind of accent, can be disadvantaged. Yeah, overweight, yes. Okay, so good. So again, the purpose of us doing this is not to pity anyone, it's not to blame anyone. It is literally critical that we be able to surface some of these differences. Now, you all do realize that in some states, what we're talking about is illegal. And I bring that up because I'm hoping that by going through this kind of conversation, you all, if you're encountering someone who is opposed to having these kinds of conversations about power, you can say it's really not about blaming, it's about stating the facts so that together we can create a system and systems where everybody has equal opportunity and access. That's the goal. Okay, yes, World Mental Health Day. I will tell you that I'm in Nashville for a client engagement, and I could have just stayed in my hotel room and ordered in. What I decided to do though was go for a power walk and then walk up the steps to my fourth floor hotel room. The reason I did that was because of mental health. It is a stressful time, so I hope that all of you are taking care of yourselves. Tom, you started off the conversation about what's happening in Florida, and I'll get right back to Shared Sisterhood. But my parents live in Florida, and they're elderly and not in good health. And my mom refused to evacuate. She was in a warning zone, but I spoke to them and they're fine. But all of those things wear on us. So, in sort of homage to Nicole's point, I hope that each of you are taking time today, especially to check in with yourself, your breathing, your exercise, all of that. I have to do that on a regular basis, doing the kind of work that I do because it's under attack, as many of you know. And sometimes that can translate into me being attacked. And I have to make sure that I am okay mentally so that I can then share with you all. Give yourself the oxygen first. So, okay, back to Shared Sisterhood. I mean, really, that's part of Shared Sisterhood, caring for each other. But Lorrie, sorry, I know I'm talking a lot.
That's why you're here. Nobody wants to hear me talk. We are here to hear you talk. But as you were speaking, Tina, I was thinking about last year when you and I just went and sat in a room for a couple of hours and talked.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
you told me that story, and it got started by talking about dig,
yeah,
the first step, which I really interpret as it's an inside job. If you want to change anything out there around you, you got to start with you. But the story that you shared with me about how you first met your co-author, Beth,
yeah,
and through that dig work, that whole process of getting to know her, you realized the first thing you needed to address was that you did not trust her. And I
yeah,
think that's such a scary thing to realize, but also just to have it come out of your mouth to say, who is this white lady coming up to me wanting to partner with me? But
yeah,
I just, think it's a very powerful process. And do you mind just sharing that story a little bit about how you guys worked through that?
Yeah, so thank you, Lori, for bringing that up. And I can also tell the playground story if you want, which was about my
Yeah,
personal
yeah,
dig work.
love
So
that.
do you want me to tell the playground story or the best story first?
Well, I love the swimming pool story also.
Well, okay, so we're going quickly. Swimming pool story is when I was really, really little. The white kids got out of the pool when I got into the pool. And so my
Right.
mother had to talk to me about racism. And my parents raised me. I'm very proud to be a Black woman. I mean, I know some people think that I should, there are some people who are like, oh, I'm so sorry you're Black. Believe it or not, people think like that. I'm like, girl, I don't know what's wrong with you. That's your problem. I love being a Black woman. I love being part of the African diaspora. And I hope you love being part of the European diaspora. But that is, but my parents had to talk to us, me in particular, but also my younger sister, about the fact that other people would look at us and our skin color and our gender and assume that we were lesser than. I've never struggled with imposter syndrome. I know that sounds crazy. I've actually had to deal with the opposite, which is I'm like, you're an imposter. I mean it for that because my parents really wanted to make sure that they inoculated us and buffered us from some of the nonsense that happened. So that's the pool story. The playground story is thank you, Tom. I mean, I love my parents so much. I'm frustrated that they won't move out of Florida, but that's a different. We'll talk about that later. The dig story is the playground story, and then I will get to the bridge story, which is Beth and I. So when my son is about to turn 22, and we now have a 19-year-old daughter as well. But when our son Kennedy was young, he was in preschool. He had a fever. He could not go to school. I was in my PhD program, and I had deadlines, but he would not sit down. So even though he couldn't go to school, he was not sleepy, tired, or anything. So I had to go and figure out a way to, sorry, tire the little boy out so that I could get my work done. So I go to the park, walk to the park with him, and it's midday. I'm expecting the park to be relatively empty because most people are working. It was not. It was jam packed. And when I looked around and surveyed the park, what I noticed was that there were a lot of women. They were brown women, and they had long, straight black hair. And I'm 6 feet tall. To me, they all looked like they were like 4'6". They were smaller than me. And I was like, are they even supposed to be in this country? What are they doing? That's the first thought that flew through my mind. And I have a saying where I say, biases are like birds. They will fly through your mind. Just don't let them nest there. I called my husband. I said, Fred, I am so racist. I cannot believe. And I told him the story and everything that happened. And I want you to know I am someone who people call, corporations call, and I had that thought. So a critical thing is it is very imperative that we don't deny that we all have biases. I see a lot of people trying to act as though we live in a quote colorblind world where racism is a thing of the past. If you haven't gotten ahead, it's because of your lack of individual effort or competence or intelligence. Listen, there's so much empirical data which refutes that. Now, am I saying that individual effort and competence don't matter? Absolutely not. It does. Hard work is an ingredient, but it is insufficient in many cases. And in some instances, it's unnecessary, meaning people who are completely incompetent have ascended to or have been put into positions that they have no business being in. So I think it's critical that we just be honest about that. So what I did not do, I called my husband and talked to him about this and sort of used him as an accountability partner. What I did not do was go up to those women and say, you don't belong in this country. Get off my swing. Go back home. I began to do research. I asked myself with the dig process, why do you think that? Where do those assumptions come from? Then I realized it's because of a lot of the things that I've read and the things that have been reinforced. I didn't have, and also my own personal network. I did not have a lot of friends or colleagues who were from the Hispanic or Latinx or diaspora. I just did not. I had not been exposed. But I began to do my research. I don't know if you all know, there was something in the United States called Operation Wetback. Google it. It's disturbing, which has to do, so all of these things, my own individual experiences, my lack of interpersonal relationships, And then also some of the institutional or systemic and legal issues compounded to result in me being a very ignorant person about the experiences of other individuals. So that is an example of where dig helped me elucidate myself. I needed to interrogate where those beliefs and assumptions came from. And once I did that, I was better able to engage in conversation. But I literally took that thought and held it up, tried to detach it from myself to examine it. It doesn't make any sense to have that thought and act like it didn't happen, or hold it up and then hide it from yourself. Uh, the way that we grow is often through change and discomfort. If you want to get better physically, health-wise, push weights. Heavier, oftentimes the heavier the better. It hurts. It's painful. But if you want to be more toned, if you want a healthier heart, if you want healthier kidneys, you have to confront your biases, which can be painful because you're now looking at yourself and saying, despite the fact that I'd like to think of myself as egalitarian, I might have some biased beliefs. And that is okay. What's not okay is to stay there. Okay, so that's dig. The best story connects to bridge. So whereas dig is about the self and interrogating the self, bridge is about connecting with people who are different than you. And again, trust, risk-taking, vulnerability, and empathy are the four attributes that we're thinking about when you develop that connection, or what we like to say, that's how we define authentic relationships, if they have those four things. So I was at the Academy of Management, and Academy of Management is the major convening organization for management and strategy scholars and entrepreneurship. So if you followed an entrepreneurship or management scholar or organizational behavior scholar, they probably belong to the Academy of Management. It's where faculty, doctoral students, et cetera, go. So there are tens of thousands of us that converge in any one city. So I just given a paper. I left the stage and there was a queue of people waiting to speak to me. And this white woman, she says, this is her word, not mine. She says she skipped up to me. And I mean, I'm sorry, this joke just is funny to me because this was the actual thought. And you've interacted with me enough, even on this call, to know that I sometimes can have challenges keeping my intrusive thoughts from coming out of my mouth. When she skipped up to me, I didn't know if I should say, hey, girl, or security, because I didn't know who she was. She was very interested in getting to know me better. I did not know if I wanted to get to know her better. Why? And this is again where I had to do dig. She was a white woman in the academy, and I have been stabbed in the back by white women in the academy. Some people might say, well, Tina, that's racist. And this is when, Lorrie, I'm going to bring up the example of the cab driver. So before we had these ride sharing apps, if I would catch a cab and it was or especially if I caught a black market cab, I would tell my friends, okay, I'm catching this cab. It should take me roughly 15 minutes to get there. If I'm not there, this is who did it. Typically, the people driving the cabs were men. Does that conversation with my friend beforehand, does that mean that I don't trust men? I don't think so. I think it means that I am aware of data which shows that the harm that is done to women is often at the hands of men. So one of the more controversial things that I may say on this call is that I need white people in particular to understand that in the workplace, people of color may view you as the aggressor, as the people who have caused the most workplace harm to them. And I know that that can be uncomfortable to sit with, but I want you to think about if we change the conversation from race to gender, it is much less threatening oftentimes for people to accept that. Oh yeah, you're right. If a woman feels uncomfortable, it's probably fair because men have done harm. But for some reason, it's less acceptable to say if a Black person, an Asian person, a Middle Eastern person, I'm careful about saying Hispanic, Latinx, because I know that some people say that is not a race, it's an ethnicity. But I have a question about that, and we can get into that later. But there are people who do not identify as white, might consider white individuals to be uh, sort of perpetrators, people who have harmed them in the workplace, whether intentionally or not. And also, There are systems in place that seem to support that behavior at such a level that we don't see reciprocated for people who are not white. So that's why when Beth came up to me, I did not trust her. And I know that's probably much more information than you may have ever heard, but that's what Shared Sisterhood is about. It's about pulling those private, behind the scene conversations into the public square for discussion and examination. I will pause there because I see a question from Tanya. How do we create a safe space? Sorry, Zayna, am I taking your job?
No, it's
Okay.
okay.
Okay, how do we create a safe space within ourselves to not shame ourselves for having biases? I think a lot of people turn away from it because it's not comfortable to think of ourselves as someone with bias. You're absolutely correct. You're absolutely correct. And I hope I don't sound dismissive, but I would say it is time to put on our big girl underwear or big boy, whatever. Because if you want to evolve as a human being, it's just like in any relationship, whether that be with your spouse, with your children, with your parents, with your coworkers, or with yourself, there comes a time where we have to be honest. I used to lie to myself about physical fitness. Doctor, I don't know why I'm gaining 30 pounds a month. I eat really well and I exercise all the time. Girl, write it down in a journal. The food journal revealed I was eating much more than I wanted to admit, and I was not exercising. And when I realized that, and unfortunately, it took a crisis. I was diagnosed with chronic kidney disease last year. That made me finally start to take my health seriously. I hope that you don't have to have the racial or gender equivalent of that to finally look yourself in the mirror and say, okay, I need to get serious about that. It is an opportunity. So I don't remember if I talked about this in Scottsdale, but in psychology, we talk about how there are different ways that you can frame things. So when we talk about creating a safe space within ourselves to confront our biases, what that suggests is that we have options. One of the ways that we often frame challenges is we try to avoid them. And in psychology, there's something called approach and avoidance. Avoidance is where we try to prevent loss. We try to prevent a loss of perceiving ourselves as egalitarian, okay? Approach is different. Approach is about pursuing opportunities. We could pursue a better aspect of ourselves. We could pursue the best self that we possibly have. Dr. Laura Morgan Roberts has an exercise called Reflected Best Self. It's out of the University of Michigan. And that's very much about, and approach is very much about thinking through, if I was my best self, what would I say to this? Would I be less fearful? I'm not saying fear less, because by the way, every time I have these conversations, there's a possibility of me stepping on a landmine. I'm not stupid, right? We're not dumb individuals. We know that something could blow up. But for me, I would much rather think about the opportunity to connect with you all, to maybe open up some conversations at your varying workplaces, rather than being afraid of me stepping on a landmine. That's the difference between avoidance and approach. There are some conversations I could just say, no, I don't want to talk about that because I know that it could lead to a failure. I'm actually, the way that I'm made up, I like to do things that could potentially be risky in some people's minds because it's fun to me. I'm an experimentalist. I'm very curious. Are there other questions?
There isn't a question. There's someone who said that they've had a different experience. It sounds like someone who's a person of color saying that they had the very different experience in work over the years, that most of their challenges have come from other people of color. So this is from T.L. Carter in the chat.
Yes, well, thank you so much. Well, so what I will say is that people of color are not a monolith.
Right.
So there are a variety of reasons. And again, it's not to say that people of color are not also problematic. Okay, and around the globe, you all have global members. Around the globe, you know, I just met with someone who was from Rwanda. Those were people of color who were in historically power dominant groups. So remember, this conversation is at the group level in part, and we're talking about groups with access to power and resources. So we have to make sure when you say TL, these things are very individualized. but there are some things that are systemic, and that's what we're talking about. So just to be clear, being a member of a historically power dominant, being an individual who is a member of a historically power dominant group does not mean that you've never had challenges, okay? Being a member of a historically marginalized group doesn't mean that you've never had success. But when you're a member of a historically power dominant group and you've had challenges, it's probably not because of your group membership. So if a man has had challenges, his life challenges are probably not because he was a man. It's probably not because he was a white person. But if we look at the law, specific to the United States, for example, I teach in entrepreneurship. I just came back from Miami where I taught MBA students who are from Latin American and Hispanic countries, and Portuguese-speaking countries as well, but Brazil, Peru, Costa Rica. Many of the women and men talked about the gender roles and the laws that were constructed that inhibited women's progress. So I understand, TL, where you're coming from. At the same time, I think we have to be careful not to conflate your individual experiences with systemic realities. Oh, TL, that's perfectly fine. You don't have to subscribe. Again, this is about everyone having the opportunity to explore. You may not subscribe to the philosophy, but the philosophy is empirically supported. So I would encourage you to perhaps read the book and maybe follow back up with Lorrie and Tom. Are there other folks who have any questions?
No, we haven't had any other questions come through in the chat, so let's keep going.
Okay, good. Lorrie,
So,
did you
yeah.
want to?
Yeah, so we talked about dig and we talked about bridge, and I'd like to talk a little bit about the next step, which is collective action. In particular, Tina,
Yeah.
the work that you've done around amplification, because
Yes.
I would guess that probably a lot of people on this call today are grappling with pushback where our DE&I work.
Yeah.
And, you're talking about systemic issues. So how do
Yeah.
we come together to work to address, even dismantle systems of inequity, and even call them out in a way that's constructive and actually, drives progress?
Yeah. Thank you for that. So the tool of amplification is a really cool tool that I love that has worked. I cannot take credit for that because it was actually utilized by someone in politics. And what was happening is there was, in this particular administration, despite the fact that this administration had more women in it than other administrations had historically, the women were still reporting that they were not getting credit for their ideas in meetings. And they were frustrated by that. And so they came up with a way where before the meeting, they would talk to other people. And I actually, Tom, in the slides, there's a cartoon slide, and by the way, on my screen, for some reason, the slides are stretched further and I can't see everything, but it just might be the way that my slides are, my computer set up. So the basic idea of amplification, and this is a tool that you all can take right away. You can use it today, this afternoon, if you want to. So the idea is,
Well, I think unless it's only for me, I think we've lost Tina for a moment. Lorrie, you're on mute. Is Tina frozen up?
She is frozen for me as well. Hopefully she'll reconnect here in a second.
As we said earlier, she's a very much in-demand speaker and very busy, and she's joining us from a hotel as part of her travels today. So it's always dodgy with the internet. Looks like she's left the session, and we'll try to rejoin.
Is this a part where we play the Final Jeopardy question music?
Right. Yeah.
Oh, my goodness. Thank you, Christine. One of the things that I know Zeta has been doing is putting a lot of things in chat. We also have a couple of links. There's a Harvard Business Review video that we have a link to where Tina talks more about shared sisterhood and what that looks like in organizations. I also found her TED Talk that she did that also discusses it in pretty comprehensive detail
Yeah,
and
and
what
Zeta
that.
just put that in the chat. And
Okay,
I
great.
believe for I4CP members, at least that are on the call, Tina's appearance at our conference that we mentioned earlier this year, I'm assuming that that clip is also up on the website for members. Is that right, Lorrie?
It should be, but
Should
that's,
be.
it should
We'd
be,
have to
but
double
Zeta might
check that.
know more about that. I think it may even be up on YouTube. I'm not positive.
Yeah. Like we said, Tina gets around and so makes a lot of appearances. And so can certainly learn more about her and the book in lots of locations. While we're waiting for her to rejoin, Lorrie, do you want to speak a little bit to some of the more recent resources we've created on DE&I as a topic? Hopefully Tina can rejoin us here, but I know we've done a lot of work in this research-wise over the years, and you've been involved with a good fair amount of that.
Sure. Actually, and our colleague Eric Davis, with whom I partner and have for many years on our diversity, equity, and inclusion research, he actually was supposed to be on the call today, but he lives in St. Petersburg, Florida, and he is knee deep in recovery activity this morning. And we wish him all the best. So this is why Tom is with us today. But yes, Eric, he and I partnered on a major survey that we did at the beginning of this year. So it's very fresh data. And we ended up putting together a very comprehensive brief called Resetting DE&I. We really wanted to get a feel for what is actually happening out there in the world, because there, as all of you know, I don't have to tell you this, but there's a lot of emotion attached to the DE&I work, unfortunately, in a lot of ways. We really wanted to know how much of this was hyperbolic stuff, what's actually happening in organizations. So the data set that we have, I think, was over 900 respondents, and it's mostly people in HR and leadership roles. The really, really, really good news that we learned from this survey we did in January and February is that 85% of those people who took our survey said that their organizations had made progress in advancing their DE&I work in the last 18 months. So what tends to suck all the attention and the oxygen is the stories about Tractor Supply and what they may be doing, and Toyota and what they may be doing. But the good news is there's really good work and progress still happening. Do not lose heart.
Yeah.
Hey,
Yeah,
Tina.
we do have Tina back, so thank you, Lorrie, for that, especially
Yeah,
for members that have access to those resources. So, Tina, when you
yeah.
lost your connection, you were telling us about amplification.
Yes, and so I think the last thing that you all heard me say was that before the meeting, I would talk to Lorrie and Tom and say, as soon as I finish, please chime in and say, Tina, I agree. Your idea on amplification is amazing. And then Lorrie, as soon as Tom finishes, you say, Tom, I agree with you. Tina's idea on amplification is amazing. And that is simple. It can take literally a few minutes. And hopefully what you're doing is you're creating an echo chamber
Yeah.
where you are making it much more difficult for someone to claim credit for my idea of amplification, which can be very powerful. I want to take this a little bit further. Many of you are leaders in your organizations. What would happen if you amplified the work of the people on your team? Think about, and that's why I know that I often do things through the lens of DEI, but it's really about culture change. If you amplify the work of the people on your team, one, that helps to hopefully improve their trust of you. Two, what happens when your employees trust you more? There's so much research which talks about things like psychological safety, as well as organizational commitment, and just the willingness to go above and beyond the call of duty when it comes to work. There are all kinds of behaviors that you cannot mandate that someone do, but things like, I don't know, arriving early to make sure that the computer works or doing a sound check. You can't make people do those things. However, the more committed individuals are, the more psycho.
Oh, the joys of trying to be on a webinar from a hotel room.
Mhm.
I know. Am I broken up again?
You're
You
back
did for a
now.
moment. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm so sorry. And I don't even know. And you should see my cursor is flickering. Anyway, we're going to move forward because this is too important of a conversation to give in. So the tool of amplification is just one example of how you can engage in shared sisterhood for collective action. And what we found, and what we're still empirically testing, is that when you engage in these kinds of behaviors, you elicit more trust from your team members, and as your employees are more likely to get credit for their work. And what happens when you get more credit for your work? You're noticed by your supervisors when you're in a positive way. When your supervisors notice you, they're more likely to promote you and get pay. And that's what we saw in this political administration, and I've seen at other organizations. So I would love it if you all would try amplification, and then just email me, let me know what happens. And I know Zaida is going to share how you reach out to me. The best way to reach out to me is via email. Connect at drteen@opie.com, and I think we're going to put that email in the chat so that you all can connect. But I would love it if you all would please, please, please email me. Just try amplification for yourself or for people on your team, and let me know how it goes.
And you know what, Tina, we even have data on that. Tom, you may refresh my memory if I'm getting this wrong, but we have done a tremendous amount of research over the years on leadership and effective leadership. And we found that I think we found a correlation actually to performance in terms of leaders who are developers and promoters of talent.
Oh,
They're much
absolutely.
more effective leaders. It makes sense, right? It's common sense, but when you have data that really shows how powerful it is,
Yeah,
and we know there's a tendency to hang on to that talent and hoard the talent and hide their
Right.
light under a bushel because, but yes, those leaders who really amplify the talent on their teams are the most effective leaders.
I love that. I think that that
Yeah.
is, and that's what we're finding as well. And this builds up again. You can develop a reputation as the kind of leader who really amplifies other people's work. And also, you can hopefully become the kind of leader known to have zero tolerance for someone claiming credit for work that they did not do.
Yeah, those traits of a leader, actually, we like to draw the contrast between a manager or a leader who is a
Yeah,
hoarder of talent, someone who keeps down, doesn't amplify the talent on their team, doesn't develop their people, versus what we like to call a talent magnet, someone who will just attract the best talent to their team because they've developed the reputation of somebody who
yeah,
will amplify their people, will develop their people. And frankly, that goes a long way to ameliorating any problems there may be with losing your best talent by taking that approach. It is
yeah,
human nature, as Lorrie was alluding to. You want to hold on to your all-stars because you've got goals to meet. You're a leader with KPIs and metrics that you're supposed to meet. But long run, the longer term perspective is to develop your people and amplify their ideas.
yes. I love that so much. And it just works. It makes people trust you more, and it creates a kind of stickiness on your team. People actually, I don't, this is not always true, but I've heard people say people often don't leave organizations, they leave bosses, because
Yes.
the boss is the person who's responsible for your day-to-day experiences at the organization. What kind of boss can you be? Can you be the kind of boss that people want to work for, want to learn from, feel respected by, and can grow with? So, I think it's really critical that amplification is not just, a cartoon. It is something
Yeah.
that can fundamentally help to shift culture.
Hey, Tina, I can't, the hour has flown by and we have our last few minutes and I really want to make the most of it. And I know you're not a legal advisor, but would you mind just giving some coaching to all of our friends on this call in terms of responding to the negativity that's out there. And, you know, we talked the other day about how we have a tendency to overreact and over-respond because there's this bottom small percentage of naysaying contrarians who are whipping everybody up. But anyway, can you share some coaching with all of us?
Yeah, well, I think it's hard to say fear not, but what I mean by that is what we're seeing is inevitable. I think I shared, I'm married to a historian. And so if you look at history, you will realize that the pendulum swings back and forth in terms of civil rights, social justice,
Right.
inclusion, the United States, and we're talking about the United States, but obviously we're global. But if I'm from the United States, the idea that we are holding the United States responsible for living up to these beautiful ideals that I think many of us believe in. And sometimes we've fallen short, sometimes we've gotten closer. As we push to get closer to living or enacting the values that we espouse, inevitably there are people who are going to push back. And listen, we sit on this very call that everyone doesn't agree with us. But I think it is okay to say, let's have a conversation. Let's have a conversation. Let's open up the discussion. And so I say fear not because I think this is predictable. I will tell you in 2019 and 20, when my phone and email inboxes were ringing off the hook and full, and I couldn't respond, I have a roundtable, a group of individuals and trusted advisors who are in the similar space. We were all saying, what is it going to take to make it, the pendulum's going to swing. When? We just didn't think it was going to be as quick as it was. We thought we were going to have at least a couple more years. So that's the first thing. The second thing is really to embed yourself in a community of people who don't just agree with you, but who may have divergent thought, but who I would say center and prioritize the value of equity. And equity is different than equality. Equality means everyone gets the same thing. Equity is about justice, making sure that the ratio of inputs and outputs are similar. So if someone is putting in 8 hours of work of roughly the same quality as someone else, we would expect the outputs in terms of promotion, pay, et cetera, opportunity to be the same. But that's based on inputs and outputs. That's the second thing. The other thing that I would say is be open. I heard several people talking about being curious. So one of the things that really helps to enliven this work for me is that I'm consistently saying, well, what if I'm wrong? What if this isn't true? I would encourage people who have heard things that makes them uncomfortable. What particularly made you uncomfortable? What was your emotional reaction to that? And interrogate that. Because unfortunately, emotion, opinion are not the same thing as fact. And we live in a society where people equate that. And I've seen leaders do this and we've had to.
Yeah. I think we all have.
And I think this is a good place to close. And thank you, Tina. Thank you, Lorrie, for facilitating the conversation.
Absolutely. Always a joy.
Thank you so much, everyone. And I'm sorry about the technical difficulties.
Thanks again, Dr. Tina. And thank you again, Lorrie and Zeta.